let's talk about the culture surrounding women in the New Testament. But Nicole, why does it matter? Who cares? I'm gonna give you 3 reasons why you should care about this. Number 1, the better you understand the culture that surrounded Jesus during the time of his ministry, the better you understand his response to it and his reformation of it. Number 2, Jesus was a profoundly scandalous figure during his day. But for us today, it can be kind of hard to understand how that could be with how much reverence and respect is paid to him by people who are both believers and non-believers. But understanding why Jesus was such a divisive figure during his time is incredibly important to understanding his ministry in general. And 3, I think one of the best ways to learn to love Jesus Christ is to know more about the lives of the people that he knew and that loved him during his lifetime. Okay, let's get into this. There were 50 specifically mentioned women in the New Testament, and that doesn't even include the countless women in the crowds that surrounded Jesus all the time. Though they were rarely the center of the stories told, the women who surrounded Jesus and their interactions with him and their perceptions of him not only matter, but are enlightening to anybody who's willing to take the time to pay attention to them. The biggest hurdle for us in understanding these stories and these women and their experiences is that there is a vast cultural chasm between our day and that of the first century Jewish and Greco-Roman world. And as humans, we can't help but try to apply our experiences to that of others. We wear these really thick lenses of our day whenever we're looking at the times and the people of the past. And honestly, that's not doing us any favors when it comes to understanding the teachings of Christ. Here are 3 facts that you need to know to understand what it was to be a woman, or at least how women were perceived, in first century Israel. Number 1, segregation by gender. First century Jewish Pharisaic traditions kept men and women physically segregated from one another. This physical segregation naturally led to emotional segregation, which naturally led to severe misunderstandings and distrust between men and women. Women were seen as a root of temptation and therefore were veiled, silenced, and kept away from men as much as possible. Especially in the cities, Jewish women were discouraged from going outside of their homes to avoid being seen by men. This protocol existed in Jerusalem and expanded into other large cities where Jews lived at the time. For example, in Alexandria, which was the 3rd largest city in the Greco-Roman Empire, there was a Jewish philosopher named Philo who described the ideal segregation in this way, and I quote, "Marketplaces and open-air life full of scope and discussion and action, all these are suitable to men. The women are best suited to the indoor life, which never strays from the house. A woman, then, should not be a busybody, meddling with matters outside her household concerns. She should seek a life of seclusion." Yep. This belief that women had no part to play in the open-air world and were expected to be confined to their homes had been accepted for centuries and was well within the cultural expectations of the New Testament era. This life of seclusion, as a couple of historians put it, confined women at home as in a prison. Of course, like any human endeavor, there were levels of extremes depending on who the person was. So the closer the relationship a woman had to a Pharisee, like a wife or a daughter or a mother of a Pharisee, the more secluded they were. Oftentimes in very wealthy Pharisaic homes, there were segregated rooms that were only for men or only for women. And in many Pharisees' homes, women were not even allowed to be seen in the doorway in case someone, specifically a man not related to them, may pass by and see them. Nowhere in life was the segregation clearer than in Jewish religious worship, adherence, and education. Much of Jewish religious worship was communal and done largely outside of the home, which meant that the Jewish women could not participate fully in their own religious traditions. Of course, there were aspects of their religious traditions and commandments that only women could uphold, and those things brought them a lot of spiritual pleasure and joy and honor. But even in those things, women were demeaned. Many Jewish men felt honored to be entrusted with 613 commandments to uphold, and they often pitied women that God only trusted them to uphold 6. Though these regulations may have begun from a place of trying to protect women or uphold the law of chastity, they eventually spiraled out of control, leaving women degraded and demeaned and labeled as untrustworthy and spiritually incapable. Jesus routinely disregarded these regulations surrounding the segregation of men and women. Not only did Jesus chastise his disciples for turning women away, but he actively and purposefully sought out meaningful relationships with the women who followed him. Think about the love and respect he showed Mary, Martha's sister, when he defended her right to sit at his feet and learn from him. Or think of the love and admiration that Jesus showed the woman who had the issue of blood, who touched the hem of his garment, who, by the standards of their day, A, should not have been out in public where she could be seen by so many men, and B, because she was considered ritually impure, she could have been stoned to death because she was considered a moral threat to anyone who came in contact with her. In these situations, Jesus not only modeled what it was to have love and respect for women, but also defended their right to a spiritual education and a respected public presence. Okay, number 2, we're going to talk about communication problems. A natural extension of the problem of segregating by gender is that it creates communication problems. Women were expected to remain silent in the presence of men, and not just men that they didn't know, but their husbands and their fathers. Ben Sira, one of the most influential Jewish thought leaders of the Second Temple period, said this: "A silent wife is a gift from the Lord. Her restraint is more than money can buy." Equally appalling, the renowned Rabbi Joshua claimed that any girl or woman caught talking with a man in the street was guilty of breaking the law of chastity unless there was evidence otherwise. Then, yet another influential renowned rabbi told men, "He that talks much with womankind brings evil upon himself, neglects the study of the law, and at the last will inherit Gehenna, or hell." Yeah, apparently that was a thing. Jesus did not silence women. He did not shy away from their presence. In fact, the opposite is true. He often spoke openly and frankly with them. Consider Jesus' interaction with the woman at the well. Not only was he with this woman who had a bad reputation, but he spoke openly with her. He allowed her to ask frank and sometimes disrespectful questions and confront the things that he was saying. In fact, I kind of think he delighted in her boldness. On top of that, he gave her little tidbits of information about who she was talking to so that she, over the course of their conversation, could, with her own intellect, divine that she might be talking to the Messiah before he flatly told her so. Okay, and finally, number 3, the reality of being a witness. Okay, as mentioned before, there was a deep-seated distrust of women in this culture at that time, and that led to the genuine belief that women were inherently dishonest and untrustworthy. And so women could not act as witnesses in a religious or legal manner. Much of the reasoning for this came from scriptures that said things like, "And bring 2 men," or "and let the men stand before God and witness." Because it always used the word men or man, they had this assumption that women couldn't possibly do it and just were not capable or didn't qualify somehow. This was so ingrained within the culture that it extended well beyond the court of law into everyday matters. Like in situations of marriage, women were expected to provide evidence of their virginity because, and I quote, "We may not rely on her word, but she must be presumed to have been trampled of a man unless she can bring forth proof for her words." Yeah, this was not a great time to be a woman. Jesus destroyed the assumption that women could not be witnesses before he was even born. In the circumstances of his conception and birth, consider who the most powerful witnesses of his divinity were: Elizabeth, his mother Mary, and Anna at the temple. These women were enlisted to be the very first witnesses of the divinity of Jesus Christ. Throughout his ministry, Jesus called upon women to be important witnesses of his mission on earth. Then, when it mattered the most, it was women, specifically Mary Magdalene, that Jesus Christ showed himself to as a resurrected being. And then he enlisted them to go and tell everyone else that he had risen just as he had promised. It was women that he entrusted with the testimony of the divinity of his birth, and it was women that he entrusted with the testimony of his glorious and miraculous resurrection. It was in that moment of unparalleled importance that Jesus showed that not only can women be trusted as witnesses, but should be trusted as witnesses. Beyond all of that, Jesus defended women's intellectual and spiritual capacities and their inherent social value, all the while carving out real and meaningful space for them in his kingdom. There are many more aspects of the Second Temple era Jewish culture that I could get into that demeaned and hurt women, which Jesus dismantled during his ministry. But the main point of all of this to me is that the women who encountered Jesus and his teachings learned that they had intrinsic value. Jesus never once demeaned women, nor did he put them up on a pedestal as idols of virtue and spirituality. He saw women for what they were: humans with spiritual and moral insights and the capacity, on par with men, to decide for themselves how to best use them. When I think of my Savior, I think of the Jesus who broke down the barriers of fear, judgment, and self-righteousness to offer opportunities to those who had been denied them for so long. And that's why it matters that we know what life was like back then, so that we can appreciate just how astounding the Savior truly is.